Okay. Who planted the seed for the 19th Amendment, and when did that happen?
I think it was decades before it actually happened.
Oh yes. Oh yes.
Decades
Yes.
before, and I can't bring the
Yes.
name forward from my.
Are you talking about the
My hard drive.
women's rights
Falls.
convention in Seneca Falls?
Yes.
No, that's not the
Before
answer.
that
It
even.
was before that.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm gonna say Abigail Adams.
Ah, you got it. Do you know when? Do you know when?
No, but it was right by the it was when they were developing the Constitution.
That's correct.
Yeah.
You got it. You got a
Yeah,
prize.
exactly.
I'm not sure what the prize is. We're going to give you a prize of a water.
Carolyn, I'm
No, that's
behind
true.
you.
On March 31st, 1776. So this was before the Declaration of Independence. Abigail Adams wrote to her husband, who would of course be the second president. I will quote this because this is really great. I long to hear that you've declared an independency. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power in the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. To the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. So clearly, John Adams' colleagues did not heed her advice. However, that did not mean that the whole idea of women's suffrage went by the wayside. And so, of course, the date that we usually think of for the official beginning of the suffrage movement was 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York, when I always have to remember names. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, they organized the first women's rights convention. And they were not just concerned about women's suffrage. That was not their only motivation. Because at the time, and this was some of the things that Abigail Adams was concerned about, they were concerned about the fact that at the time, married women could not own property. If there was a divorce, they had no rights to their children. And if they earned any money, they had no rights to that money. So in other words, they had no autonomy. So the idea of women's rights, that was when we would consider the suffrage movement to officially begin. Now, obviously, or not obviously, but as is usual the case, after that, many people they mocked what happened at that convention. It was like, oh, God, are you kidding? No. But that didn't mean that all of the women just left it alone. In fact, a number of women, they kept moving on with their concerns. And of course, eventually, Susan B. Anthony joined them. And Susan B. Anthony, of course, is the person that we know that we most directly connect with the suffrage movement. But now let's think about the time frame. We're in the 1850s. And of course, during the 1850s, the issue of abolition of slavery was much more prevalent than was the issue of women's suffrage. However, it's important to know that the two really go hand in hand, and many of the groups that were concerned about the abolition of slavery were also concerned with women's suffrage. So after the Civil War, with the passage of the 14th Amendment, which of course gave anybody who was born in the United States citizenship, women thought that had granted them the right to vote. And so guess what they did? They started voting. And guess what happened? They said no. And so up to and including Susan B. Anthony was actually arrested for trying to vote. And that position was upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1875 by saying that the right to vote is a state privilege. It does not reside in citizenship. It resides with the states. So, So then the next amendment that was considered was, of course, the 15th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment was the amendment that gave black men the right to vote. And at that point, there was actually a split in the women's suffrage group. It was a group at the time, and it split because Stanton and Anthony, they wanted to continue to try to have a national effort to have an amendment to the U.S. Constitution. However, let me get the name right, and her husband and some others, they supported the 15th Amendment because the other group did not support the 15th Amendment. They wanted women's suffrage. But Lucy Stone and her husband and their group, they did support the 15th Amendment. And part of it was that they thought that if women were added to the 15th Amendment, it would not pass. Yeah. So, and so what their choice was, they said, no, we need to go through the states. We need to have the state constitutions include women's suffrage rather than try to do it at the national level. Okay. So I'm not going to get into all of the nitty-gritty of what happened in the late 1800s, but what I want to do is we're going to kind of a little bit fast forward to actually when it was passed. But we need to set the stage because, of course, in the latter half of the 1800s, this was the time of what? What was going on? This was the Gilded Age. We had rapid industrialization. We had rampant political corruption, and the industrialization was unregulated, and so that resulted in the exploitation of many people, of all of the workers, and the workers were men, women, and children, as well as with the urbanization that occurred. All of a sudden, you had basically it was the mechanization of the farms as well as the mechanization of the factories, of the development of the factories. So there was this huge migration from farms to the city, and that caused. So in the cities now we're dealing with poverty, crime, very poor sanitary conditions, so lots of disease, and social unrest. Well, of course, the political reaction to that was the progressive movement. And the progressive movement, not to the same extent that during the New Deal, but the progressive movement really believed that women should be involved in public policy. And the reason they should be in public policy is because of their traditional roles as mothers and wives, i.e. caretakers, and they were also considered the keeper of virtue. But what that did is that softened the political opposition to having women women vote. However, there were three things that really precipitated the 19th Amendment, and the first one was that, remember I said that the women's groups, they split into two.
Right.
Okay, and one of them wanted to go via the states, and that was extremely successful, actually. And of course, we all know about Wyoming being the first state to have women's suffrage. They actually awarded it, they actually included it in their constitution as a territory, and so when they became a state, it was automatically was included in there. But by 1918, 16 states had already given women the right to vote. Most of them, virtually all of them, were in the West, which of course had a much more egalitarian social structure than the East and the South. But one of them was New York, and that was kind of a tipping point. But I digress. So the fact that the states had been successful, that was very important. But at the same time, gotta get my name right. Chapman Catt. How many of you ever heard of Carrie Chapman Catt? You are the expert. You are the expert. You should be giving this. And if I make any mistakes, you tell me because if I'm making a mistake, I want to know. Okay, Carrie Chapman Catt. She was the president. So I told you, those two groups, they got a divorce. Well, they remarried in about 1890. So now they are combined again. And she was the president in 1950, and she was very instrumental in weaving together the combination of the state efforts and the national efforts. And so all of a sudden, it wasn't that they were apart anymore, they were interwoven. And the other thing that happened was this little thing called World War I. And much like World War II, when the men went off and fought in the war, guess who worked and kept the economy and the social structure together? Women did. And Mrs. Catt was very instrumental in making sure that that was publicly known, and that including, up to and including Woodrow Wilson knowing about that, because he was of course the president, and he was opposed to women's suffrage. But he was eventually convinced that no, women were really important to the war effort, and we all know that that was very important to Woodrow Wilson. So the combination of the states, the success with the states, as well as the World War I, those were kind of the underlying things, coupled with the progressive movement. So there's all of these are kind of they're supporting all of this. But there was a tipping point, and the tipping point was who was the I have one more thing to add about Carrie Chapman Catt. She also was the co-founder of the League of Women Voters, so she was really instrumental. And anyway, but Alice Paul was she was the next generation of the suffragists. So, and she and some of her friends, they were like, I'm really tired of all of this, easy and nice way of doing it. They were much more militant, and so they organized demonstrations, including having daily picketing of the White House. So one could argue that yes, Woodrow Wilson did realize that women played a role in World War I, but it could also be that they just drove him nuts because they were outside every day and he wanted them gone. So, but in addition, what happened is, and this often, we see this today as well, is that some of the activities that the women were engaged with, it caused them to be arrested, jailed. Some of them went on hunger strikes, and so the reaction to the women, there was public outrage that these women were being treated so horribly. And so with that, on May 21st, we'll see how fast this goes. May 21st, 1919, so we're now into 1919. The amendment was introduced in the House of Representatives. June 9th, same year, couple weeks later, it was passed by the Senate.
Wow.
Then, of course, it went to the states for ratification. And as we all know from our Constitution, to amend the Constitution, 3/4 of the states need to ratify it. So at the time, they needed 36 states. So within the time it takes to conceive and bear a child, about 9 months, the 35 states had ratified it. But now, guess where we're going? We're going into the South, and there was opposition in the South to women voting. So we're going to Tennessee. Tennessee's the first state up, and on August 18th, 1920, we're now in 20. The state legislature in Tennessee, they were split. They were split down the middle, 50-50. And it all boiled down to one person, Harry T. Byrne. And Harry T. Byrne was a 23-year-old young man who had publicly stated, in fact, there was this, they wore a white rose if they were in favor of the amendment, and a red rose if they were not in favor of the amendment. He wore a red rose, so he was opposed to it. Until guess who influenced him?
His mother.
His mother. And this is what she said to him. Yeah, this is the quote.
You'll never get a home-cooked meal.
No. Be a good boy and help Mrs. Cat put the rat in ratification. And he voted for it. So with that, the amendment was ratified by the three quarters of the states that needed to approve it. And oftentimes it's not a confusion, but there's a certain, some people say, well, it was ratified on the 18th of August, and some people say the 26th. Both of them are correct. The reason is that, yes, it was ratified by the 36th state on August 18th, 1920, but it had to be certified by the U.S. Secretary of State. That happened on August 26th, and that's why that's why the two dates exist. So both of them were needed, and who cares? We'll just say it was August 1920. So here's my other question: was the last to ratify the amendment, and what year did that happen? I'll give you a hint. It was a southern state.
Georgia.
Not Georgia, not Florida, not Alabama. Go a little bit more west. Mississippi. What year? 1984. Yes. 1984. Yeah, because it was ratified in 1920, so it was 1984. So if you go to it's the national parks. They have what date every state ratified it, and territories. So one of the questions that I had was, okay, so what role did AAUW play in all of this?
Good question.
1881.
1881? No, what? 1884. What role did AAUW play in it?
Sorry.
No.
No?
No. I cannot say I did an exhaustive review of the history of AAUW, but what I read about the history of AAUW, I saw no reference to the 19th Amendment. Nor did I see any reference in all of the review that I looked up for the 19th Amendment. Oh, either AAUW or its predecessor, the ACA. But there's a reason for that. I mean, I'm speculating that there's a reason for that. And the reason that is that if you look at the history of AAUW, when it first started in 1881, what the members were concerned about, they had really three concerns. One was that women did not receive an inferior education to men. As more women went into higher education, there was a tendency toward having a two-tiered system, one for men and one for women. And they were adamant about standards and making sure that the quality of education for women was the same as it was for men. So that was their first concern. The second concern was really about their members, to make sure that these were women who were degreed and that they and their credentials would be valued and recognized in society. And the third, of course, is one that we continue, and that is to make sure that more women had access to higher education. So in reality, their mission was about education, about higher education. Now, my guess is that many of the women were also involved in the development and the ratification of the 19th Amendment. They simply did it through different groups and not AAUW. So it's not that they weren't incompatible. It was just that AAUW was a very small organization, and it was really focused on education per se. So with that, I will open it up for questions or comments or whatever.